Hello, my name is Jack Rabinovich, and this is my poster presentation, 2 Ways to Existentially Close a Proposition. Linguists often distinguish root clauses from embedded clauses, where root clauses may exist independent of other clauses in a sentence, and embedded clauses are only grammatical in embedded contexts. The differences between these two clauses is not only in their distribution, but also in the phenomena they exhibit. While root clauses allow discourse markers and fronting of certain arguments, embedded clauses often do not, and are typically marked with the complementizer. However, this distinction is fuzzy, considering that many languages embed clauses with root phenomena, so-called embedded root phenomena, or have independent clauses with embedded phenomena, so-called insubordination. While embedded clauses are often thought of as representing propositions, full sentences are speech acts. In this presentation, I argue that root phenomena is in part caused by the presence of speech act semantics, accompanied by an additional syntactic domain above the CP. In Ibero-Romance languages, speech act embedding results in both embedded root phenomena and insubordination. Since Searle 1969, it has generally been thought that propositions and speech acts are distinct ontologically. Propositions are functions from worlds to truth values, while speech acts are turns in a commutative game. Speech acts consist of a sentence radical, typically a proposition, and an illocutionary force, which type-shifts the sentence radical into a speech act. Syntactically, this is reflected in Spizenteni 2003's split of the left periphery into a lower propositional domain and a higher speech act domain. The speech act domain hosts illocutionary material, such as discourse particles and vocatives, which are thus restricted to the far left or right of a sentence, as in 5. Material in the speech act domain seems to not be truth conditional, such as evidentials, which often fail dissent tests. In 6, while the respondent can directly challenge whether or not Inez visited her sister, they cannot challenge the evidential force given by the reportative particle that the speaker was told this. Fowler argues that this is because evidentials affect sincerity conditions rather than truth conditions. While a proposition is true when it accurately represents the state of affairs in a world of evaluation, a speech act is sincere when it accurately represents the state of mind of the speaker in a given context. Following Core 2016, I use utterance phrase, or UP, to refer to the syntactic projection of the speech act domain, while I reserve CP for the propositional domain. Thus, while CP material is truth conditional, UP material is sincerity conditional, with the application of illocutionary force and the force P acting as an interface between the two. Root phenomena, such as placement of discourse markers, are thus only possible when sincerity conditional speech act semantics, accompanied by the UP syntax, are present. This way of splitting the CP and UP domains ontologically closely mirrors Ramchan-Svenonius's analysis of the differences between the VP, TP, and CP domains. For them, the VP, TP, and CP are sortal domains, meaning that they are distinguished from one another by the ontological sort which is represented and modified in each domain. Events are represented and modified in the VP, situations in the TP, and propositions in the CP. The domains have a strict syntactic hierarchy because the sorts have a strict cognitive hierarchy, where each sort is an elaboration of the sort below it. Domains are separated by interfacing heads, which introduce a higher sort argument, relate that higher sort to the lower sort, and existentially close off the lower sort. This can be seen in 10, where the VP is an event-taking predicate, whose event E argument is related to a situation S via an aspectual relation, before being closed off. The resulting aspect phrase has an open situation argument, which can then undergo predicate modification with the situation-taking predicate of a T-head, becoming a situational TP. We can extend this theory into the UP domain and introduce speech acts as a sort, cognitively above propositions, with a force relation as an interface relating the lower propositional sort P to the higher act sort A. Thus, we can mirror the structure in 10 as an 11, where the CP represents a proposition-taking predicate, which combines with a force head that become an act-taking predicate, which can then combine with discourse markers and U-head positions. The entire sortal spine of a clause can thus be seen in 12, with 4 sorts and 3 interfacing heads between them. This allows us to compositionally construct the sincerity conditions given by a speech act. In the 13, the proposition "it is raining" in green combines with an assertive force in purple. which for our purposes creates a sincerity condition that the embedded proposition is believed by the speaker. The resulting force P undergoes predicate modification with a discourse marker, alas, in yellow, which restricts the sincerity condition such that it is sincere if the speech act expresses sadness. Thus, the truth conditions of alas it is raining is that it is raining, while the sincerity conditions are that the speaker believes that it is raining, as given by the assertive force relation, and that the speaker is sad about it, as given by the entry of alas. Under a Kratzerian framework, attitude verbs are unable to directly embed propositions, and instead take entity-type arguments with propositional content. Complementizers, as denoted in light blue, function to type-shift propositions into entities via a compatibility relation, as in 14. The relation small caps comp is true of a proposition P and an entity X if X refers to a proposition P sub X, with the same truth conditions as P. Because propositions of the same truth conditions can be said to be the same proposition, this effectively means that X refers to the proposition P, or that entity X has the propositional content of P. For Kratzer, complementizers are two-place predicates, as in 14c. For a Ramchand's-Venonius framework, complementizers can be seen as a sort of interfacing head between propositions and entities. In this way, a complementizer introduces an entity argument, relates the entity to a proposition, and then existentially closes the propositional argument, as in 14d. Either way, a complementizer headed CP will be an entity-taking predicate, which can then restrict the entity argument of a verb, as in 15, where no takes an entity argument which is restricted to having the propositional content of it is raining by the embedded CP. The application of complementizers in illocutionary force are two ways to existentially close propositions, each relating them to a different sort, entities for complementizers and speech acts for illocutionary force. Because they both close off propositions, they are not stackable within the same clause. The root phenomena that occurs due to the presence of a UP domain thus cannot occur under a complementizer, restricting root phenomena to root clauses. Likewise, assuming that all independent clauses are of a speech act type, root clauses cannot be headed by a complementizer or exhibit other embedded phenomena. However, as we can see in 16, some languages such as Spanish do embed speech acts. 16a embeds a proposition, and thus the clause who was coming is evaluated with respect to the world. Juan is reported as saying the list of people such that they were coming. 16b, which has the inserted k, however, reports Juan saying not the list of people, but a question, a request for knowledge of who was coming. The embedded speech phrase here is thus a speech act with illocutionary force, rather than a proposition available for truth conditional evaluation. Similar to the Kratzerian complementizer, we can understand K in a reportative context to be a relational head between speech acts and entities. Rather than a compatibility relation, I propose the existence of an analogous suitability relation. In 17b, small caps suit is a true of a speech act A and an entity X if X refers to a speech act A sub X, such that A sub X and A have the same sincerity conditions. Thus, a K-embedded speech act refers to the sincerity conditions of some specific speech act with which the speaker is referencing. The referent need not be the actual embedded utterance. It may be a speech act uttered in the past or an imagined speech act spoken by the current speaker or someone else. And it need not be verbatim, as long as the sincerity conditions of the embedded speech act A and the reference speech act A sub X are the same. Thus, K takes a speech act taking predicate UP, opens up an entity argument, relates the entity and speech act via a suitability relation, and existentially closes the speech act argument, resulting in an entity taking predicate available for selection by a verb, just like the complementizer CP15. Importantly, because the suitability relation is evaluated as true or false, it is truth conditional. Thus, one can derive truth conditions from an embedded speech act, not from its force, evidential or otherwise, directly, but in how its force represents the sincerity conditions of the speech act which the entity argument refers to. For 18, the sincerity conditions of the embedded commanding speech act are not evaluated with respect to the utterance context, but rather serve as a representation of the sincerity conditions of the speech act which Juan said. Thus, the sentence is true if Juan said some X with the sincerity conditions A of a command telling someone to do their task. Interestingly, These effects also help to explain insubordination. In Spanish, insubordinative phrases come in the form of sentences which begin with K. These sentences carry a reportative flavor, such as in 19A, where the speaker asserts news about their favorite sports team with the evidential flavor that they know it because they were told this information. Echepare argues that in these cases, K-headed phrases represent an entity which undergoes silent predication. Thus, insubordination in Spanish is effectively the same as its equivalent embedded root phenomena, with a speech act related to an entity via K. In embedded root phenomena, this entity is predicated overtly. In insubordination, it is predicated covertly. Like the embedded command in 18, the evidential force of an insubordinative clause is embedded under a suitability relation, meaning that its sincerity conditions are not evaluated in the utterance context and that it is truth conditional, and thus able to be directly challenged as in 19b, where the respondent denies the evidential force that the speaker was told the information. This is unlike the Quechua example in 6, as shown below, where the evidentiality is part of the matrix speech act, not embedded under a suitability relation, and thus not available for dissent. This can be seen in 20, where the reportative feature in Quechua exists outside the domain available for truth conditional evaluation. Ibero-Romance languages, however, also have instances of insubordination which do not have embedded equivalents, such as exclamations, which are unable to embed under verbs, but may follow discourse markers at the beginning of a clause, such as in 21. Though this can be explained by silent predication, Searle's analysis of exclamations in English may give us an alternative. Searle argues that the sentence radical of an exclamation is not propositional, but is instead an entity, which has some relation to the speech act itself. For example, in 22, hurrah is a speech act predicate which additionally takes an entity argument. The relationship between speech act and entity is not mediated by a force relation and thus does not relate a proposition to the speech act. Thus, these speech acts do not have any truth conditions. As a result, exclamations cannot undergo dissent of any kind. Because the K phrases represent entities, a discourse marker like I in Galician may act similarly to hurrah and take the embedded UP not as a speech act predicate, but rather as an entity predicate, closed by K. Thus, I denotes exasperation at an entity, and while this entity may be referred to an individual like you or me, the entity in 21 refers to a speech act. Thus, 21 does not assert any proposition, but rather expresses exasperation at a given speech act, or as I take it, the implied prospect of uttering said speech act. This speech act has the sincerity condition that the speaker believes that the addressee thinks the speaker has all day. Thus, the speaker presents the embedded speech act as something that they may be sincere in saying, while expressing their exasperation that it may be warranted in being said. In this case, the speaker is annoyed that the addressee may think that the speaker has all day. And without directly committing to saying so, the speaker expresses that they feel justified in asserting it, and quite annoyed by that fact. The translation and source text punctuation is appropriately that of a rhetorical question, which also implies that the speaker is justified in asserting something without explicitly asserting it. Switching to another language family, Hooper and Thompson in 1973 introduced an analysis of Germanic embedded root phenomena, whereby embedded V2 clauses are asserted as part of the illocutionary force of a sentence. For instance, 24 does not only assert one's commitment to the belief of max snoring, but also asserts max snoring itself. This gives it a stronger sense of commitment than an equivalent sentence with verb final word order. The inclusion of assertion as part of the embedded clause would make the embedded verb final clauses propositional and embedded V2 clauses speech acts. However, the Hooper and Thompson analysis is distinct from my analysis in that Hooper and Thompson argue that embedded force is asserted as part of the utterance force, while the suitability relation I propose does not assert the embedded force as part of the utterance force, but rather references some other past or imagined speech act with that force. Again, the Spanish embedded commands and questions we have seen so far are not evaluated as commands or questions in the utterance context, but represent the sincerity conditions of some reference speech act. Furthermore, recent work such as Wieklund et al. 2009 and Yerv 2019 has pushed back on the Hooper and Thompson analysis and argue that embedded V2 expresses that information is discourse new, rather than asserting the embedded proposition. There are quite a few differences between embedded root phenomena in Ibero-Romance and Germanic languages that hint that Germanic embedded root phenomena is constrained to the propositional domain. The first is that Germanic embedded root phenomena can occur under verbs, like believe, which are generally assumed to not embed speech act content. This is the case in Spanish, which bans embedded root phenomena under believe and know. Second, negation can affect the grammaticality of embedded root constructions in Germanic languages, which hints that the semantic selection is not reliant on the difference between two different sorts, but rather a difference in the availability for discourse new information to exist in affirmative and negative contexts. Third, the suitability relation forces an embedded speech act to represent the sincerity conditions of a reference speech act, which has a specific instance of being spoken. It seems that, for Germanic languages, this embedded V2 clause does not need to reference a specific instance of speech, thought, or belief, but can instead be more generic, referencing general thoughts or beliefs that an individual holds. Altogether, while the addition of a UP seems promising for embedded root phenomena in Ibero-Romance languages, it does not hold up when applied to Germanic languages. Core argues that Ibero-Romance languages differ in what kind of K clause embedding they allow, due to differences in feature bundling or splitting. For example, Portuguese allows K exclamation constructions, but not reportative constructions. Core argues that this is because Portuguese bundles its declarative and evidential features, disallowing K to attach an evidential head without blocking illocutionary force from the force head, as they're both on the same head. Galician and Spanish split these features across different heads, allowing questions and commanding force Ps to embed under an evidential K. If this is the general cause of embedded root phenomena across the UP, then it may also be the case for embedded root phenomena in the CP. Thus, we may be able to unite Ibero-Romance and Germanic embedded root phenomena as both caused by feature splitting, allowing more heads for lexical generation and movement, with differences between languages explained by the differences in splitting across both the UP and CP domains. Today, I've presented an analysis of speech acts as a sort belonging to a sortal domain in the same vein as Ramchand's Venonius. This domain is represented by the syntactic projection of illocutionary force. Complementizers and illocutionary force are two ways to existentially close off propositions, causing complementizer-based embedding to exhibit embedded phenomena, and clauses with illocutionary force, most commonly seen in matrix clauses, to exhibit root phenomena. However, UP embedding is possible and can result in both embedded root phenomena and insubordination, as is seen in Ibero-Romance languages. Finally, I discussed Germanic embedded V2, providing evidence that this form of embedded root phenomena is constrained to the CP domain. Finally, I suggest that the feature scattering effects in the UP of Ibero-Romance may have a CP analog responsible for embedded verb second in Germanic languages. Thank you very much for listening.